NASA once proposed nuking the moon just to flex on the Soviets, handed astronauts a diaper called a maximum absorbency garment, and somehow trained chimpanzees for spaceflight before ever trusting a human. How did any of this get approved with a straight face? We're talking foldable moon rovers that looked like origami toys, a jetpack so expensive NASA used it 10 times and quit, and a lunar bowling alley pitch that actually made it into a real meeting. Stick around because these 51 absurd space race inventions get more unhinged with every single number, so smash like and hit subscribe before this list launches without you. 1. NASA supposedly spent millions inventing a magical pen that could write upside down just to outdo the Soviets in style. That story sounds impressive, but it is only half true, and honestly funnier than the myth itself. The Fisher Space Pen was developed privately, with zero NASA funding involved at all. NASA simply bought a handful off the shelf once it already existed and worked. Meanwhile, Soviet cosmonauts really did just use ordinary pencils the entire time, without complaint. Sometimes the coolest space technology on Earth is a 2-cent piece of wood. 2. Astronauts are usually pictured casually strolling into orbit and figuring out bathroom logistics like total naturals from day one. Reality was a lot messier than that daydream ever suggested to anyone watching. NASA actually built an entire zero-gravity toilet training simulator just for this exact problem alone. Early missions proved that gravity was doing everyone a much bigger favor than anyone ever realized. Astronauts practiced for weeks perfecting their aim before ever leaving Earth at all. Nobody wanted the capsule turning into a floating disaster zone way up there. Conquering space apparently required conquering the toilet first. 3. The moon boots astronauts wore during training are often imagined as sleek futuristic gear built for graceful lunar strolls across dusty craters. The actual prototypes were nothing close to graceful at all during early testing phases. Versions were so clunky and stiff that astronauts kept tripping over their own feet during test runs on solid ground. Engineers had to redesign the boots multiple times, just so grown men in NASA jumpsuits would stop face-planting in front of cameras and reporters. Walking on the moon required first surviving several embarrassing walks across a parking lot. 4. A fully inflatable space station might sound like something dreamed up in a cartoon rather than a real NASA blueprint from serious engineers. Yet engineers seriously proposed exactly that during the height of the space race competition with the Soviets. The concept earned the nickname the beach ball in orbit because of how bouncy and lightweight the design actually looked on paper drawings. It promised cheap and easy deployment for astronauts living far above Earth for extended missions. The idea never fully launched, but decades later, similar inflatable modules quietly made their way into real orbital stations. 5. The astronaut diaper sounds like a joke. Someone invented purely for comedy, but it was very real NASA hardware used during actual missions. Officially named the Maximum Absorbency Garment, it was worn during long missions when bathroom breaks simply were not an option for anyone aboard. Early versions leaked constantly and caused more discomfort than anyone in mission control wanted to admit publicly to the press. Astronauts quietly endured soggy suits while representing the pinnacle of human achievement above Earth. Space exploration apparently required conquering rockets, physics, and also some seriously uncomfortable undergarments. 6. Toothpaste in space sounds like a minor detail nobody would ever think twice about back on solid ground on Earth. NASA discovered otherwise once they realized spitting simply does not work properly in zero-gravity conditions aboard the capsule. Engineers developed a special space-safe toothpaste that astronauts were instructed to swallow completely after brushing their teeth each time. It was formulated to be harmless if ingested, though astronauts still found the whole process fairly strange and unpleasant. Even basic hygiene became a genuine engineering challenge once gravity stopped cooperating with anyone involved. 7. The manned orbiting laboratory sounds like something ripped straight from a spy thriller rather than an actual government program from history. It was a secret military space station developed during the Cold War with serious ambitions behind its classified design. Billions of dollars and years of planning went into designing this classified orbital outpost built purely for surveillance purposes. Despite all that effort, the program was canceled before a single astronaut ever set foot aboard it at all. Sometimes the most expensive secrets in history simply vanish without anyone ever noticing they existed. 8. A NASA-funded jetpack sounds like the ultimate symbol of futuristic freedom, soaring effortlessly above the ground for any daring astronaut. Testing actually went remarkably well, and the device performed exactly as engineers had hoped it eventually would perform. Despite the impressive results, the project was quietly shelved because officials decided it was simply too dangerous for regular everyday use. Strapping explosive fuel to a human back turned out to carry more risk than convenience apparently ever intended. The dream of everyday jetpacks stayed grounded while rockets got all the attention instead. 9. The Vomit Comet sounds like a nickname invented purely to scare new astronaut trainees before their very first terrifying flight ever. That nickname was earned entirely on purpose thanks to the aircraft's brutal and unforgiving flight pattern design. NASA built this plane specifically to fly steep parabolic arcs that create brief moments of weightlessness inside the cabin repeatedly. Nearly every trainee who boarded ended up getting violently sick at some point during the entire experience. Preparing humans for space apparently required making them thoroughly miserable back on Earth first before launch. 10. Freeze-dried ice cream is often sold as the ultimate futuristic astronaut snack enjoyed constantly aboard every single mission in orbit. The truth is, a lot less glamorous than the packaging and gift shops would ever suggest to curious tourists. Real astronauts rarely, if ever, actually ate this chalky treat during genuine spaceflight missions far above Earth. Instead, it became a novelty item mostly purchased by tourists visiting museums and gift shops back on Earth. The real space snack myth turned out to be more marketing gimmick than actual astronaut menu item. 11. Nuking the moon sounds like a plot twist from a bad science fiction movie, rather than a real Cold War proposal from serious officials. Yet the United States seriously studied launching a nuclear weapon at the lunar surface just to intimidate the Soviets during the tense space race. The project was nicknamed A119 and was kept secret for decades before details finally leaked to the public. Scientists worried a visible explosion would boost American morale and terrify rivals watching from Moscow. The plan was eventually scrapped, though the sheer audacity of it still shocks people today. 12. Big Gemini sounds like the name of a wrestling move, rather than an actual spacecraft concept from NASA engineers. It was designed as an oversized capsule meant to carry far more astronauts and cargo than the original Gemini missions ever could. Engineers drew up detailed plans, imagining it ferrying crews to space stations, and even future lunar bases. Despite the ambitious vision, the design proved too expensive and complicated to ever leave paper drawings behind. Sometimes the boldest space ideas never make it past a conference room table. 13. Space mirrors beaming sunlight onto farms sounds like a supervillain scheme rather than a serious agricultural proposal from engineers. NASA seriously explored the idea of orbital reflectors that could bounce sunlight down onto fields during nighttime hours. The goal was extending growing seasons and helping farmers boost crop yields using nothing but redirected daylight. Critics worried about disrupting nocturnal animals and messing with natural sleep cycles across entire regions. The glowing farmland dream never launched, but the ambition behind it still feels wildly futuristic today. 14. Spiders spinning webs in space sounds like a bizarre science fair project rather than an official NASA experiment with real funding. Researchers genuinely wanted to know whether the arachnids could still build proper webs once gravity disappeared entirely. Two spiders named Arabella and Anita were sent aboard Skylab specifically to test this strange scientific question. Their webs initially looked messy and disorganized, before the spiders adapted and produced surprisingly normal patterns over time. Even 8-legged astronauts apparently needed some practice adjusting to life without gravity. 15. The Manned Maneuvering Unit sounds like the ultimate space-age gadget, letting astronauts fly freely without any tether at all. This jetpack allowed astronauts to float untethered outside the shuttle, using small thruster controls built into the armrests. Despite years of development and enormous cost, the device only ever flew on a handful of actual missions. Safety concerns following the Challenger disaster led NASA to quietly retire the technology altogether afterward. A tool built for ultimate freedom ended up spending most of its life sitting in storage. 16. Apollo-era space gloves sound like a small detail nobody would ever think twice about compared to rockets and heat shields. In reality, engineers went through dozens of clumsy failed versions before finally getting the design right for astronauts. Early gloves were either too stiff to bend or too fragile to survive the harsh lunar environment outside. Neil Armstrong himself reportedly helped test versions that were uncomfortable and limited basic hand movement significantly. Even the smallest piece of a spacesuit required years of frustrating trial and error before success. 17. Inflatable moon habitats sound like luxury glamping tents rather than serious housing plans for future lunar astronauts. NASA proposed lightweight inflatable structures that could expand once deployed on the moon's surface for long-term stays. Early prototypes honestly resembled oversized camping tents more than anything resembling a proper space station. Engineers argued the design saved weight and launch costs compared to rigid metal modules built entirely on Earth. The moon may eventually be colonized using something that looks suspiciously like a backyard camping tent. 18. A folding lunar rover sounds more like an origami art project than a serious vehicle meant for driving across the moon. Engineers designed the rover to collapse into a compact shape, small enough to fit inside the lunar module during launch. Once astronauts arrived, they had to manually unfold the entire vehicle before it became functional for driving. The process looked awkward on camera, yet somehow worked perfectly every single time it was attempted. Sometimes the most advanced space technology still looks like complicated furniture assembly from a manual. 19. Growing potatoes on the moon sounds like something ripped straight from a Hollywood movie rather than an actual decades-old proposal. Long before The Martian made the idea popular, NASA scientists studied growing crops in lunar soil simulant during early research. The goal was determining whether future astronauts could sustainably feed themselves during extended stays far from Earth. Results were mixed but promising enough to keep the concept alive within scientific circles for years afterward. Hollywood eventually turned a real NASA experiment into a blockbuster without most audiences ever realizing it. 20. Space food cubes sound like an efficient futuristic solution, rather than the disappointing snack astronauts actually experienced during missions. NASA developed compressed food cubes designed to be easy to eat and simple to store aboard cramped spacecraft. Astronauts quickly complained that the cubes tasted like chalky cardboard with almost no real flavor whatsoever. Crumbs also became a serious problem since loose particles could float freely and damage sensitive onboard equipment. Feeding humans in space turned out to be far trickier than simply shrinking a sandwich into a cube. 21. Nuclear-powered rockets reaching Mars in weeks sounds like pure science fiction rather than a serious engineering proposal from actual NASA scientists. During the 1960s, researchers seriously studied nuclear thermal propulsion as a faster alternative to traditional chemical rocket engines. Early tests showed genuine promise for dramatically cutting travel time between Earth and Mars for future missions. Concerns over radiation safety and public fear following nuclear accidents eventually killed funding for the ambitious program entirely. A rocket that could have shrunk interplanetary travel time got grounded by politics instead of physics. 22. Astronauts carrying guns into space sounds like a ridiculous action movie plot rather than a genuine NASA safety discussion from officials. Engineers seriously debated equipping crews with firearms in case a spacecraft landed off course in a hostile or remote area. Soviet cosmonauts actually carried a specialized survival pistol for exactly this reason during several real missions. American officials worried more about wildlife encounters than enemy soldiers waiting somewhere out in the wilderness. Surviving re-entry apparently was not scary enough without also planning for a possible bear encounter afterward. 23. A secret art piece hidden inside a lunar mission sounds like something from a heist movie rather than actual NASA history. The so-called Moon Museum was a tiny ceramic wafer engraved with artwork from famous artists, smuggled aboard Apollo 12 secretly. NASA never officially approved the tiny artifact, and its exact origin remains debated among historians even today. Supporters claim it quietly rode along attached to a lunar module leg, without anyone in charge noticing. Somehow, a tiny unauthorized art gallery may have reached the moon before most earthly museums expanded internationally. 24. Giant rotating solar sails powering a space station sound like something pulled from a comic book rather than real engineering blueprints. NASA researchers proposed massive reflective sails that could capture sunlight and convert it into usable energy for astronauts. The design promised nearly unlimited power without relying on heavy fuel tanks or complicated onboard generators for the crew. Structural challenges and enormous size requirements ultimately kept the ambitious concept confined entirely to paper and computer models. Sometimes the most elegant power solution in space simply cannot survive the harsh reality of budget constraints. 25. Duct tape saving America's first space station sounds like a joke rather than an actual documented NASA engineering emergency. Skylab suffered serious damage during launch, including a torn heat shield that threatened the entire mission before astronauts even arrived. Engineers on the ground quickly improvised a makeshift sunshade using materials including simple adhesive tape and long collapsible poles. Astronauts successfully deployed the fix once aboard, preventing the station from overheating and becoming completely unusable. The most sophisticated space agency on the planet was ultimately rescued by hardware store-level ingenuity. 26. Cardboard mock-ups becoming actual flying space taxis sounds like a stretch, until you learn how NASA prototypes often really begin. Engineers built early cardboard and plywood models to test seating layouts and general shapes for proposed passenger spacecraft concepts. These humble prototypes helped designers visualize cramped interiors long before expensive metal versions were ever considered for construction. Many promising concepts never advanced past this early cardboard stage due to shifting budgets and priorities within NASA. Sometimes the future of spaceflight briefly lived inside a garage built entirely from cardboard and glue. 27. Cockroaches surviving a simulated Mars landing sounds like the setup for a horror movie, rather than genuine NASA research. Scientists studied how resilient insects handled extreme gravitational forces, similar to what a spacecraft might experience during a rough landing. Cockroaches were chosen specifically because of their famously tough bodies and ability to survive brutal physical conditions. Results suggested certain insects could indeed endure forces that would seriously injure or kill an unprotected human passenger. Humanity may eventually reach Mars only to discover cockroaches were already perfectly equipped to survive at first. 28. The big wheel space station design sounds like something torn straight from a vintage pulp science fiction magazine cover. Engineer Wernher von Braun proposed a massive rotating wheel-shaped station designed to generate artificial gravity for long-term astronaut comfort. The rotating motion was meant to simulate Earth-like gravity, making extended stays in orbit far more livable and comfortable. Despite capturing public imagination through magazines and television, the concept never advanced beyond detailed drawings and models. Popular culture embraced the wheel-shaped station decades before real engineers ever attempted anything remotely similar. 29. Golf balls flying across the moon sounds like a joke rather than an actual moment captured on video during a NASA mission. Astronaut Alan Shepard famously smuggled a golf club aboard Apollo 14 and hit 2 balls across the lunar surface. NASA scientists later seriously studied how lunar gravity and lack of atmosphere affected the unusual golf ball trajectories recorded that day. The stunt became one of the most memorable and lighthearted moments in the entire history of American spaceflight. Even hundreds of thousands of miles from home astronauts apparently still found time for a quick round of golf. 30. A speech prepared for astronauts stranded forever on the moon sounds like dark humor rather than an actual government contingency plan. Officials seriously drafted remarks for President Nixon to deliver in case Apollo 11 astronauts became permanently trapped on the lunar surface. The speech somberly honored the crew as martyrs, while Mission Control would have cut communication before their air ran out. Thankfully, the mission succeeded, and the grim speech remained locked away unused for decades afterward. Behind every triumphant space achievement, apparently sat a chillingly prepared backup plan nobody ever wanted to actually use. 31. The Gemini Paraglider sounds like a wild carnival ride rather than a serious NASA landing system once seriously considered by engineers. Officials wanted a way for capsules to glide down and land on solid ground instead of splashing into the ocean. Engineers spent years testing a large wing-shaped parachute meant to give astronauts more control during descent and landing. Repeated technical failures and mounting costs eventually forced NASA to abandon the concept entirely in favor of traditional parachutes. Sometimes the fanciest landing idea on paper simply cannot beat a reliable splash into open water. 32. Giant tin cans stacked end-to-end sounds like a child's art project rather than an actual proposed space station design. Engineers seriously studied modular stations built from cylindrical sections launched separately and connected together once safely in orbit. The simple stacked shape made manufacturing and launching easier compared to more complex rotating or wheel-shaped alternatives. Elements of this humble tin can concept quietly influenced real station designs used decades later by multiple countries. Sometimes the least glamorous shape in engineering turns out to be the most practical solution available. 33. Training chimpanzees for spaceflight sounds like a joke rather than a genuine and carefully documented NASA program from the early era. Before risking human lives, officials sent chimpanzees like Ham and Enos through rigorous training to test spacecraft safety systems. These animals learned to pull levers and perform simple tasks while strapped inside cramped capsules during test flights. Their successful missions provided crucial data that helped convince officials human astronauts could safely survive similar space conditions. Long before any American walked in space, a chimpanzee quietly paved the way first. 34. The Apollo lunar module being joked about as tinfoil sounds like an insult rather than an accurate engineering description. Engineers intentionally built the module's walls incredibly thin to save weight, since every extra pound made the launch dramatically more expensive. Astronauts reportedly said they could poke a finger straight through certain sections of the fragile spacecraft walls. Despite looking flimsy, the design proved remarkably effective and successfully carried astronauts safely to the lunar surface and back. Sometimes the most fragile-looking machine in history turns out to be surprisingly trustworthy after all. 35. Solar-powered lawnmowers keeping a future moon base tidy sounds like pure comedy rather than any real serious engineering discussion. Concept designers occasionally sketched playful ideas, imagining how lunar colonies might maintain artificial green spaces inside sealed habitats someday. These early sketches were less about the moon and more about testing solar power efficiency for small practical machines. The lighthearted concept never became an actual NASA project, but still highlights how far imaginations wandered during that era. Even amid serious rocket science engineers, apparently still found time to imagine tidy lunar lawns. 36. Trained pigeons guiding missile-based spacecraft sounds like an absurd fantasy rather than a real Cold War-era research proposal. Behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner actually proposed using pigeons pecking at targets to guide early missile guidance systems before better technology existed. The birds were trained to peck screens showing a target image which would help steer the missile toward it. Officials eventually abandoned the bizarre project once electronic guidance systems became reliable and far more practical for military use. For a brief, strange moment, America's missile defense nearly depended entirely on a few well-trained birds. 37. Giant space mirrors advertising soft drinks sounds like a corporate fever dream rather than a real proposal ever seriously discussed publicly. In the 1990s, a private company actually pitched launching a massive orbital billboard visible from the ground below at night. The idea sparked public outrage from astronomers worried about light pollution, ruining stargazing, and disrupting nocturnal wildlife everywhere. Regulatory pushback and public backlash eventually killed the controversial advertising concept before it ever reached orbit successfully. Even capitalism apparently has limits once it starts threatening humanity's view of the night sky. 38. A bicycle exercise machine crammed inside a tiny space capsule sounds uncomfortable, rather than a smart solution for astronaut health. NASA discovered that extended time in zero gravity caused astronauts to lose muscle mass and bone density surprisingly quickly. Engineers squeezed compact exercise equipment into cramped capsules so astronauts could maintain their strength during longer missions in orbit. Astronauts often had to strap themselves down just to keep from floating away mid-workout session. Staying fit in space apparently required as much creative engineering as getting there in the first place. 39. A literal metal escape pole for astronauts sounds like something from a firehouse, rather than serious space shuttle safety equipment. NASA engineers designed a telescoping pole that astronauts could slide down to bail out during a low-altitude emergency situation. The device was meant purely as a last resort, allowing crew members to clear the shuttle's wing before parachuting safely. Thankfully, the pole was never actually used during a real emergency throughout the entire shuttle program's history. Sometimes even the most advanced spacecraft in history still needed a backup plan borrowed from a fire station. 40-point orbital gas stations refueling spacecraft mid-mission sounds like something from a futuristic road trip rather than a serious 1960s proposal. Engineers seriously studied depots in orbit where spacecraft could dock and refuel before continuing onward toward deeper space destinations. The concept promised to dramatically extend mission range without needing to launch every drop of fuel from Earth directly. Budget constraints and competing priorities kept the ambitious refueling stations confined entirely to theoretical studies for decades afterward. Modern private companies are now quietly reviving this same futuristic idea that engineers dreamed up generations earlier. 41. Tang being treated as a serious nutritional supplement sounds like clever marketing rather than an actual documented NASA decision from officials. Astronauts really did drink the powdered orange-flavored beverage during several early missions as part of their planned nutrition. NASA never actually invented the drink itself, but simply adopted an existing product already sold in grocery stores. Clever advertising later convinced the public that Tang was a groundbreaking space-age invention, created specifically for astronauts. A humble grocery store drink somehow became one of the most famous myths in American space history. 42. Sending astronauts past a planet hot enough to melt lead sounds like a suicide mission rather than a real serious NASA proposal. Officials genuinely studied a manned Venus flyby that would send a crew past the scorching planet using leftover Apollo hardware. The mission never required landing, since Venus's surface remains far too hostile for any spacecraft, let alone actual humans. Engineers argued the flyby would test long-duration spaceflight while using equipment already built for lunar missions. The proposal quietly died once budget cuts made ambitious, post-Apollo missions increasingly difficult to justify politically. 43. Playing musical instruments in zero gravity sounds like a party trick rather than a genuine subject of NASA scientific study. Researchers seriously examined whether floating freely would affect an astronaut's ability to breathe properly and control instruments requiring precise movement. Several astronauts eventually brought small instruments aboard missions, proving that music could indeed survive the harsh vacuum of space travel. Guitars, keyboards, and even a saxophone have all successfully floated aboard various stations over the following decades. Turns out humanity's need for music apparently follows us wherever gravity happens to disappear entirely. 44. Painting spacecraft hulls with reflective paint, just to confuse Soviet radar, sounds like spy fiction rather than an actual proposal. Cold War engineers seriously discussed coatings that could scatter or distort radar signals to disguise spacecraft movement from rival nations. The idea blended legitimate material science with genuine Cold War paranoia about surveillance and tracking capabilities from opposing superpowers. Most versions of this concept remained theoretical since tracking technology quickly advanced beyond what simple paint could realistically fool. Even something as simple as paint became a tool in the tense technological standoff between two nations. 45. A lunar bowling alley boosting astronaut morale sounds like the punchline to a joke rather than a real pitch once discussed seriously. Engineers occasionally proposed recreational activities for future moon bases to help astronauts cope with isolation during extended lunar stays. Low-gravity bowling was imagined as a lighthearted way to keep crews mentally healthy and entertained during long stretches of downtime. The concept never advanced past casual discussion, but reveals how seriously officials took astronaut mental health even decades ago. Someday future lunar residents might genuinely settle disputes with a friendly game of extremely low-gravity bowling. 46. Astronauts debating whether they could grow beards in space sounds trivial, rather than an actual genuine early NASA policy discussion. Officials worried that loose facial hair might interfere with oxygen masks or float freely and clog sensitive onboard equipment. Strict grooming standards were enforced during early missions, partly for safety reasons and partly to maintain a clean-cut public image. Later missions eventually relaxed these rules once engineers confirmed beards posed no serious risk to astronaut safety. Even something as small as facial hair once required serious debate among America's most brilliant rocket scientists. 47. Moonsuit cooling underwear. Nicknamed the world's most expensive long johns, sounds absurd rather than a real documented piece of hardware. Astronauts wore specialized garments lined with tiny tubes circulating cooled water to prevent dangerous overheating inside bulky lunar spacesuits. The system cost NASA an enormous amount of money to develop, despite looking like ordinary underwear at first glance. Without this hidden cooling layer, astronauts risked severe heat exhaustion while working under the intense, unfiltered sunlight on the moon. Sometimes the most expensive piece of the entire spacesuit was also the least visible to the public. 48. Trained dolphins helping recover splashdown space capsules sounds like a Hollywood gimmick rather than a genuine recovery proposal once discussed. Officials considered using the Navy's Marine Mammal Program to assist divers locating and securing capsules floating in the open ocean. Dolphins were already trained for underwater tasks, making them a surprisingly logical choice for this unusual recovery assignment. The idea never became standard procedure, though it highlights how creatively officials approached solving unusual logistical challenges. Space exploration apparently occasionally required consulting some of the ocean's most intelligent and cooperative animal residents. 49. Testing whether tear ducts function properly in zero gravity sounds oddly specific, rather than a legitimate area of NASA scientific research. Scientists discovered that without gravity, tears do not fall, and instead simply pool strangely around an astronaut's eyes. This unusual finding meant crying in space could actually blur vision or cause discomfort rather than providing any relief. Researchers studied the phenomenon partly out of curiosity and partly to understand basic human biology in extreme environments. Even something as universally human as crying apparently behaves completely differently once gravity disappears entirely. 50. Surplus missile silos becoming emergency shelters for astronaut families sounds like a conspiracy theory rather than an actual Cold War contingency plan. Officials seriously discussed repurposing decommissioned military silos as fallout shelters, protecting astronaut relatives during heightened nuclear tension between the two superpowers. The plan reflected genuine anxiety that Cold War hostilities could escalate at any moment, even during peaceful scientific missions. Thankfully, the shelters were never actually needed, though blueprints reportedly existed for select high-profile families. Even space heroes apparently needed backup plans for disasters happening right back on Earth. 51. An orbiting billboard funding future NASA missions sounds like a wild internet joke rather than an actual proposal discussed by real officials. Various private groups have pitched launching massive advertisements into orbit, visible from the ground, to generate revenue for space programs. Astronomers strongly oppose the idea, fearing permanent light pollution that would interfere with stargazing and serious scientific research. Regulatory hurdles and widespread public backlash have consistently kept these ambitious billboard concepts from ever actually reaching orbit successfully. Sometimes even NASA's boldest funding ideas simply cannot compete with humanity's desire to see the stars clearly. So there you have it, 51 certified pieces of NASA absurdity, proving that America did not just race to the moon, it accidentally invented golf on the lunar surface, diapered its heroes, and almost let pigeons steer a missile along the way. And honestly, that is exactly the kind of unhinged engineering energy we live for here on Dumb Historical Inventions, where the smartest people alive keep somehow building the goofiest gadgets in human history. So if your brain just melted a little, smash that like button, subscribe so you never miss the next batch of ridiculous inventions, and drop a comment right now telling me which one of these 51 absurd ideas was the dumbest or the most unbelievable to you. Because trust me, we are just getting started.